Pick up your hand and look at it. The bones inside that hand, the metacarpals, the phalanges, the carpals at the wrist, are not the bones that were there 10 years ago. They look identical. They are in the same positions. They connect to the same tendons and are covered by the same skin. But the mineral matrix that gives them their rigidity, the collagen framework that gives them their resilience, the cells embedded within them, all of it has been replaced. The bone that was there a decade ago was dissolved, digested, and rebuilt. What you are looking at is the new construction. This is happening right now, across every bone in your body simultaneously. In a healthy adult, approximately 10% of the total bone mass is being remodeled in any given year, which means that over a decade, the entire skeleton cycles through replacement. Not all at once, the process is site-specific and continuous, with different skeletal regions turning over at different rates, the trabecular bone of the vertebrae and femoral neck cycling faster than the cortical bone of the long bone shafts, but the cumulative turnover across a decade is complete. The name for this process is bone remodeling, and it has been one of the most intensively studied areas of skeletal biology since the 1960s, when Frederick Albright first characterized the cellular machinery involved. The two cell types that execute remodeling are the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts, and their coordinated activity is the subject of a biological control system as precise and consequential as anything in the body. Osteoclasts are large, multinucleated cells derived from the monocyte macrophage lineage. They attach to bone surfaces, seal a space between themselves and the bone, and acidify that space to a pH of approximately 4.5, dissolving the hydroxyapatite mineral and digesting the collagen with cathepsin K, a protease specifically expressed in osteoclasts. A single osteoclast can resorb bone at a rate of approximately 200 to 400 microns per day, excavating a tunnel or trench through the bone matrix called a resorption lacuna. Osteoblasts are derived from mesenchymal stem cells and are the construction crew. They line the resorption cavities left by osteoclasts and synthesize new bone matrix, primarily type 1 collagen, which then undergoes progressive mineralization with hydroxyapatite over a period of months. An osteoblast that survives the mineralization process becomes embedded in the new matrix as an osteocyte, the cell that remains in bone for the remainder of that bone packet's lifespan, and that is responsible for sensing the mechanical loads that determine whether the next remodeling cycle produces more or less bone. The balance between resorption and formation determines bone density. When osteoblasts produce exactly as much bone as osteoclasts removed, the density is maintained. When formation exceeds resorption, during growth, during mechanical loading response, density increases. When resorption exceeds formation, during sedentary aging, during prolonged immobilization, during hormonal changes that favor osteoclast activity, density falls. The skeleton you will have in 10 years is being built right now. The question is what instructions the cells building it are receiving. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. In 1987, Harold Frost at the Southern Colorado Clinic published a theoretical framework that reorganized the understanding of bone biology. He called it the mechanostat theory, and its central claim was that bone tissue maintains a set point of mechanical strain, a target range of deformation under load, and adjusts its mass and architecture to keep the actual strains within that range. When mechanical strains on a bone regularly exceed the upper threshold, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 microstrain for most cortical bone, the mechanostat triggers an anabolic response. Osteoblast activity increases, new bone is added, and the bone becomes stiffer, distributing the same forces across a larger cross-sectional area, reducing the strain per unit force back toward the set point. When mechanical strains on a bone fall below the lower threshold, perhaps 200 to 400 microstrain for the skeleton of a sedentary adult, the mechanostat triggers a catabolic response. Osteoclast activity increases relative to osteoblast activity, bone mass is removed, and the skeleton becomes lighter and less stiff. This sounds counterproductive. It is, in fact, metabolically logical. Bone is the most metabolically expensive tissue to maintain per unit mass, and a mechanostat that reduces bone mass when loads are chronically below what would justify the maintenance cost is an energy conservation system. The practical consequence of the mechanostat in modern sedentary life is that the skeleton of a person who walks on flat surfaces, sits at a desk, and exercises occasionally on a stationary bicycle is operating chronically below the mechanostat's anabolic threshold. The strains produced by ordinary daily activity in this context are insufficient to signal the osteoblasts to maintain the bone mass that more physically demanding ancestral life would have required. The mechanostat does not know that the person is sedentary by cultural circumstance rather than biological necessity. It reads the strains arriving at the osteocytes and produces an output proportional to those strains. Low strains, chronically and consistently below the anabolic threshold, produce a skeleton that is being continuously remodeled into something thinner and less dense than the skeleton that preceded it. This is not osteoporosis in its clinical sense, the trabecular thinning and cortical porosity that meet the diagnostic threshold of a T-score below 2.5 on a DEXA scan. It is the pre-osteoporotic trajectory that the mechanostat's response to sedentary life produces across every decade of adult life in the majority of people who never engage in the high-impact or resistance-loading activities that would exceed the anabolic threshold. The skeleton is being rebuilt. The mechanostat is determining what it is rebuilt into. The building blocks, calcium, phosphate, collagen, are available regardless. What changes the outcome is whether the bone cells receive the mechanical signal to build more or less. In 1957, Eiichi Fukada and Iwao Yasuda at the University of Tokyo published a paper in the Journal of the Physical Society of Japan describing an unexpected property of bone. When mechanically stressed, bone generates an electrical potential. The collagen fibers in the bone matrix, arranged in a helical pattern, are piezoelectric. They convert mechanical deformation into electrical charge. When bone is compressed or bent, the collagen deforms slightly, and the asymmetric charge distribution of the collagen molecule produces a small but measurable electrical potential across the deformed region. This piezoelectric signal, typically in the range of millivolts, is not the primary signaling mechanism of the mechanostat, but it contributes to the cascade of signals that osteocytes receive when bone is loaded. The osteocytes, embedded in their lacunae within the mineralized matrix, are connected to each other and to bone surface cells through a network of fine cytoplasmic extensions called canaliculi, narrow channels that run through the bone matrix and allow fluid flow, chemical signaling, and gap junction communication between embedded osteocytes and the bone-lining cells on the surface. When bone is loaded, the fluid in the canalicular network is driven by the pressure differential through the narrow channels, creating fluid flow shear stress on the osteocyte cell processes. The osteocytes respond to this fluid flow shear through mechanosensitive ion channels, primarily piezo1 and TRPV4 channels, that open under the mechanical stimulus and allow calcium ions to enter the cell. The calcium signal triggers a downstream cascade, prostaglandin E2 release, nitric oxide production, and the upregulation of Wnt signaling factors that directly stimulate osteoblast differentiation and proliferation. The signaling pathway from mechanical loading to new bone formation is therefore load the bone, drive fluid flow in the canalicular network, osteocytes detect the flow through mechanosensitive channels, osteocytes signal to osteoblasts via Wnt factors and prostaglandins, osteoblasts differentiate and produce new matrix. Remove the load, as happens in sedentary daily life, during bed rest, during space travel, and the fluid flow in the canalicular network is minimal. The osteocytes are not activated. The Wnt signal to osteoblasts is absent. The osteoblasts that would have formed bone do not differentiate. The osteoclasts continue their baseline resorption activity. The balance tips negative. What matters about this signaling pathway is its specificity to dynamic, impact loading rather than static loading. Bone tissue can sense that it is being repetitively loaded and unloaded. The fluid flow in the canalicular network is driven by the pressure changes that come with each loading cycle. Static load, standing still, produces no canalicular fluid flow after the initial loading because the fluid redistributes and the pressure equalizes. It is the cycles of loading and unloading, the rhythm of impact, that keeps the fluid moving and the osteocytes signaling. This is why standing desks are better than sitting but not as good as walking. This is why walking is useful, but high-impact activities are more effective. The bone needs the rhythm of repeated mechanical impact to drive the fluid flow that keeps the osteocytes activated and the formation signal running. The astronaut's skeleton is the extreme demonstration of what happens when mechanical loading is removed from bone. In microgravity, the skeleton carries no weight, and the ground reaction forces that drive bone loading during walking are absent. Bone loss in astronauts begins within the first days of spaceflight and proceeds at approximately 1 to 2% per month in the lumbar spine and proximal femur, regions of high trabecular bone content that are particularly sensitive to the mechanostat's response to absent loading. A 6-month mission produces bone loss equivalent to approximately 10 years of postmenopausal age-related bone density decline on Earth. The astronaut example is important because it eliminates the confounders present in sedentary population studies. The astronauts eat the same food, have the same hormonal profiles, and differ from the control condition only in the absence of gravitational loading. The bone loss is the mechanostat responding to absent load, not to diet or hormonal change. The sedentary adult is not an astronaut. They still bear body weight during standing and walking. But the strains produced by normal daily activity in a sedentary person whose exercise consists of flat surface walking and light activity are substantially below the strains that triggered bone formation in the ancestral physical environments for which the mechanostat's set point evolved. The human skeleton was calibrated over millions of years of locomotion across uneven terrain, carrying loads, climbing, running, and performing the high-impact activities of hunter-gatherer existence. The mechanostat's anabolic threshold, the strain level that triggers net bone formation, reflects that calibration. Flat surface walking in comfortable shoes on a paved surface produces approximately 1,000 to 1,500 microstrain in the femoral shaft, at or slightly below the mechanostat's anabolic threshold for that region in most adults. It is maintenance loading, not formation triggering loading. The skeleton can maintain its current mass with walking, approximately, but it cannot increase bone density from walking alone in an adult who has already established their baseline. The consequence is that age-related bone loss, which in sedentary populations begins in the early 30s for trabecular bone and the 40s for cortical bone, proceeds against a background where the only counterforce is maintenance-level loading. The mechanostat is not receiving formation signals because the strains do not exceed the anabolic threshold. The osteoclasts continue their scheduled remodeling. The osteoblasts match them, more or less, until hormonal changes in the 50s begin to favor osteoclast activity. The balance tips negative. The skeleton reconstructed each decade is thinner than the one it replaced. Lane and colleagues at Stanford, whose longitudinal studies of bone density in active versus sedentary older adults documented the divergence of bone density trajectories across decades of different physical activity patterns, showed that adults who had maintained high-impact physical activity across their 40s and 50s entered their 60s with substantially greater bone density reserves than age-matched sedentary adults, reserves that provided a larger buffer against the accelerated bone loss that the hormonal changes of the 6th and 7th decades would bring. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. In 2007, Gerard Carcenti at Columbia University published a paper in Cell that changed the understanding of bone in biology. His laboratory showed that osteoblasts, the bone-forming cells, produce a hormone called osteocalcin that acts on the pancreas, the muscle, the fat tissue, and the brain. Bone was not merely a structural scaffold, it was an endocrine organ, producing signaling molecules that regulated metabolism throughout the body. Osteocalcin stimulates pancreatic beta cells to produce more insulin and improves peripheral insulin sensitivity in muscle and fat tissue. In mouse models, increasing osteocalcin reduced blood glucose, improved glucose tolerance, and protected against diet-induced obesity and insulin resistance. Reducing osteocalcin produced the opposite: impaired glucose metabolism and increased fat accumulation. In humans, circulating osteocalcin levels correlate inversely with type 2 diabetes risk, metabolic syndrome prevalence, and visceral fat accumulation in multiple independent epidemiological studies. Osteocalcin also crosses the blood-brain barrier and acts in the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and brainstem. Carcenti's group published in Nature in 2019 showing that osteocalcin in mice improves memory, reduces anxiety, and increases exercise capacity, and that these effects operate through specific receptors in the brain. In humans, circulating osteocalcin levels decline with age and correlate with cognitive performance in studies examining older adults. The implication that Carcenti drew explicitly: exercise improves bone formation, increases osteocalcin production, which improves metabolic health, which improves cognitive function. The chain from mechanical loading of the skeleton to brain chemistry runs through the hormone the osteoblasts produce. What suppresses osteocalcin production? Sedentary behavior, which reduces osteoblast activity through the mechanostat mechanism. The same inactivity that reduces bone density through the mechanostat also reduces the circulating osteocalcin that the active osteoblasts were producing. The endocrine function of bone is being suppressed simultaneously with its structural maintenance, through the same mechanism of insufficient mechanical loading. The person whose skeleton is undergoing net bone loss from sedentary aging is not only building a thinner skeleton during each decade's remodeling cycle, they are producing less of a hormone that the pancreas, the muscles, the brain, and the fat tissue need for their own functions. The structural and the hormonal consequences of skeletal unloading are inseparable. Not all movement loads bone adequately. The mechanostat's anabolic threshold requires strain magnitudes above approximately 1500 to 2000 microstrain, applied at a minimum rate of change. Bone tissue is relatively insensitive to very slow strain application, and the canalicular fluid flow that drives osteocyte signaling requires a minimum rate of pressure change to generate adequate shear stress on osteocyte processes. This means that the form of loading matters as much as the quantity. Impact activities, activities that involve the foot striking the ground with force, are the most accessible bone-loading stimulus. Running produces peak femoral shaft strains of 2000 to 3000 microstrain, well above the anabolic threshold. Jumping produces higher peaks. A drop jump from a 30-centimeter platform produces peak strains of 3,000 to 4,000 microstrain in the proximal femur, with the rapid strain application rate that maximizes canalicular fluid flow. Lane and Nelson at Tufts University, who conducted some of the foundational research on resistance training and bone density in postmenopausal women, showed in a randomized controlled trial published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise in 1999 that 12 months of high-intensity resistance training produced significant increases in lumbar spine and femoral neck bone density compared to controls. The weight-bearing exercises, squats, leg press, deadlifts, produced the ground reaction forces and muscular pull on bone that exceeded the anabolic threshold consistently. The specific exercises that load the most clinically significant bone sites, the lumbar vertebrae and the proximal femur, the sites of osteoporotic fracture that produce the most disability and mortality in older adults, are the ones that involve compressive load through the spine and hip simultaneously. Squats, deadlifts, lunges with loaded resistance, box jumps, and stair climbing with added weight all load these sites. Cycling does not. The absence of impact in cycling means the bone is not receiving strain above the anabolic threshold during the exercise. Michael Hewitt at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, whose work on musculoskeletal loading and injury prevention has examined ground reaction forces in multiple contexts, has described the dose-response relationship between impact magnitude, impact frequency, and bone formation response. The response is not linear. Bone adaptation to mechanical loading shows a diminishing returns curve, with the greatest bone formation response occurring in the first few hundred loading cycles per session, and minimal additional response from thousands more. This is why brief, high-impact sessions produce comparable bone formation stimulus to longer, lower-impact sessions. The bone cells are saturated relatively quickly in terms of their formation response, but they need the strain to be above the anabolic threshold. Bone loading for the purposes of skeletal maintenance and formation therefore does not require long training sessions. It requires adequate strain magnitude and adequate strain rate, applied in brief, frequent sessions throughout the day, that together exceed the mechanostat's anabolic threshold consistently enough to tip the osteoblast-osteoclast balance toward formation. The skeleton being built over the next decade is being shaped by the mechanical signals arriving at your osteocytes right now. What those signals say is determined by what you are physically doing. The protocol that the bone biology research supports is specific enough to describe in precise terms, which most bone health content does not do, because it is written at a level of generality that does not require confronting the specifics of the mechanostat or the canalicular fluid flow mechanism. 3 times per week, a session that includes high strain, high rate loading of the lumbar spine and proximal femur. This means at minimum, squats or leg press under enough resistance to produce the muscular forces that translate to bone strains above the mechanostat's anabolic threshold. In practical terms, this is a weight that challenges the person near their limit for 5 to 8 repetitions. Light resistance training at high repetitions does not produce adequate bone strain. The strain magnitude scales with the force, and forces sufficient to produce anabolic bone strains require loads near the person's capacity. If resistance training is not accessible or appropriate, jumping is the alternative that most efficiently exceeds the anabolic threshold at the hip and spine. Beck and colleagues at the University of Queensland showed in postmenopausal women that a program of 50 jumps per day, 6 days per week, produced significant improvement in femoral neck bone density after 6 months compared to control subjects. The jumps are brief. The program takes approximately 5 minutes, but the impact magnitude of each jump exceeds the anabolic threshold at the proximal femur far more efficiently than any amount of walking. Daily, brief bouts of impact loading throughout the day, not confined to exercise sessions. 10 jumps in the morning, 10 before lunch, 10 in the evening, distributed throughout the day rather than accumulated in a single session, produces better bone formation response than the same number of jumps in a single session, because the osteocyte signaling saturates within each session but returns to full sensitivity within a few hours. Nutritional inputs that the remodeling process requires. Calcium at approximately 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day for adults over 50, from food or supplement if dietary intake is insufficient. Vitamin D, at levels sufficient to maintain serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D above 50 nanomoles per liter, the threshold below which calcium absorption from the gut becomes significantly impaired. Protein at adequate levels to support collagen matrix synthesis. The collagen scaffold must be constructed before mineralization can occur, and inadequate protein intake limits osteoblast collagen production. The vitamin D and calcium without mechanical loading is like having building materials delivered without anyone at the construction site. The materials will sit unused. The mechanostat must be above threshold for the building to proceed. Mechanical loading is the general contractor. The nutrients are the materials. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient without the other. The skeleton you will inhabit in 10 years is being decided in the decisions you make about loading your bones in the years between now and then. The osteoclasts will continue their scheduled demolition regardless. The osteoblasts will build what the osteocytes instruct them to build, and the osteocytes will issue those instructions based on the strains they detect in the canalicular fluid flowing around their processes. Make the fluid flow. Make it flow above the threshold. The skeleton will rebuild accordingly, not because bone is obedient to your intentions, but because the mechanostat is a precise biological control system that produces exactly the skeleton the mechanical signals demand. The signals are yours to send. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.